study of anthropology proves that from the very beginning of mankind, social living was essential for their survival. That living alone, the human race could never have survived. And we are today at a certain stage in that stage of evolution, which goes back about 1 million years. Now, if we today don't follow that same pattern, we also can be extinct. So it is important, it's extremely important, and they are identical to your statement, which they laugh at.
Yes, but I think we haven't come to Sartre yet. We've talked about Kierkegaard today, and I think it would be fair to say that Kierkegaard is not too terribly worried any more than I would think Jesus was, and Kierkegaard is a Christian. He is not too terribly worried about whether mankind will survive or whether it will not survive. What he is worried about is the other world, is going to heaven. And what he concerns himself with, in line with a tradition that is strong in Christianity, and by no means totally absent from Judaism either, what he concerns himself with is what you might call the remnant, the exceptional individuals. Now, I'm not trying to say that you should accept this. There's something, as I've tried to bring out, deeply undemocratic about his whole attitude. He is not concerned about the greatest possible happiness of the greatest possible number. Not at all. What he is concerned with is how a man might become a good Christian, or if you want to put it differently, what the individual might have to do in order to be saved when he dies. This is something that's puzzling in many a reformer, that he revolts against the church, but then may add, and this is Kierkegaard's line clearly, that he revolts against it in part because it isn't authoritarian enough. So it's easy to sympathize with him because of his individualism, but you might say, if ever you got your way, if ever you got your will, what would happen to people like you? It's a similar feeling, just first of all by way of bringing out that this problem isn't confined to Kierkegaard, that one might have, for example, about a man like Plato, who criticizes the society that he lives in, Athenian democracy, because it isn't authoritarian enough, and he is a great rebel and a great individualist and a great iconoclast and a great critic. But what he would like to have is the kind of society in which people like he would have no place at all. Now we have something similar to that very clearly in Kierkegaard. And I think what he would say is that certain kinds of beliefs should be insisted on by the church, and that there should not be any leeway when it comes to whether you do or don't accept central dogmas about Christ, but that, of course, the individual might have some leeway in having some deep experience. What he objects to is a religion in which deep experience is something that would be an embarrassment, in which deep experience would almost disqualify anybody from membership because it just wouldn't belong, because it would be so extraordinary and exceptional. The deep experience is compatible, I should think, with a more authoritarian setup. Perhaps I can draw an analogy here which will be familiar to some of you, and that would be that perhaps in Orthodox Judaism, in religious services, you would be much more likely to see many people seized by stark religious experience than you would in more liberal services. And perhaps you would find the same sort of thing also between fundamentalist Protestant services and liberal services. The deepness and the intensity of the experience is compatible with a good deal of traditionalism and orthodoxy. I think that this is particularly frightful rather than being something that in any way can reconcile one to Kierkegaard. I think that with a strangely and disturbingly prophetic soul, he rightly sees that his knight of faith is not a fanatic with fire and sword, but the man who is willing to commit atrocities with a firm faith that everything will come out all right, and who, to be drastic about it, comes back, say, from his having liquidated a few million people to his family, and is a very nice father and a very nice husband, and, as Kierkegaard puts it, to quote him, in ordinary life you can't tell him from a tax collector. I think he is dead right about this, and I find it deeply disturbing, but most people are too romantic and too dramatic about it. They think that people who commit deeds like that must be obviously monsters, as if they sort of must have horns and tail. But Kierkegaard sees quite rightly that if a man has the firm faith that what he is doing is all right, and that in the end it will all be for the best, even though if you argue with him, he'll have to admit that it's absurd. How could it come out for the best? Still, he believes somehow it will. Then he can afterwards go back to his family and be quite undisturbed. Exactly, that's what I'm saying. Well, a man like Kierkegaard wistfully deplores his own rationality, his own integrity, his own conscience, saying, if I did a thing like that, I would not be able to go back. And instead of saying, that's because I am too decent a man, he says, that's because I don't have the kind of faith that one ought to have. At this point, obviously, I don't agree with him at all, and I don't suppose any of you had the idea in the first place during my lecture that I am in any sense a follower of Kierkegaard, even though I tried to give a sympathetic interpretation.
What explains today's interest that Kierkegaard has found among so many people today who really disagree with him? A man who is so contrary to the spirit of modern times.
Because it's much more fascinating to deal with somebody who deals with interesting problems that have some relation to one's own life than to read about things that strike one as wholly academic and irrelevant to one's own life. I think that's the main reason. A secondary reason is that he wrote well, and a tertiary reason is that there are some psychological insights that sort of spice the reading. There was a lady a little to the left there. Kierkegaard thought, and at this point I find him impossible to follow, he thought that the only way to transcend this despair was by being a good Christian. At this point I simply cannot follow. This doesn't make any sense to me at all. First of all, you might say, well, let's be a little bit more broad-minded. What about being a Jew, or what about being a Buddhist? Couldn't one transcend it in that way too? Or one might ask, what about being the kind of man, let's say, that we will come across as we consider Nietzsche and Sartre, familiar to some of you from Camus' novels? Might it not be possible without any religious faith? I think here Kierkegaard doesn't argue, but is just dogmatic, and to me, at this point, he isn't plausible at all. I can take just one more short question. I don't see why the Orthodox Church, why a church that would measure up to Kierkegaard's expectations, would have to condemn Abraham. What Kierkegaard is saying, in effect, is the parson is a hypocrite if he praises Abraham Sunday morning, but Sunday afternoon, if a member of his congregation should go out to do likewise, but try to stop him. But now, why couldn't somebody first preach faith, and then if people also have got it, cheer them for it and be happy about it? I would say that the dreadful thing at this point is that the church so often has done again just what Kierkegaard wanted it to do, that people have preached to other people to go out and burn other people at the stake and kill other people, and then have not stopped them either, but quite consistently allowed them to go ahead with that. You're entirely right that according to Kierkegaard, Abraham couldn't communicate it, but the parson might do what Kierkegaard says he would do, just reverently stand back and say, here is a great man, here is the kind of man who resembles Abraham, let's canonize him. On that note, let's close for today.